Welcome, everyone, to UUSF Forum. It's good to see people back, familiar faces, and a couple less seen faces. So good to have you here. Today, we have Norman Solomon from rootsaction.org speaking on militarism and U.S. foreign policy. Before we introduce Norman he's going to be presenting by Zoom, by the way, so you'll be seeing his face on the screen here in a moment. He is remote. Just a few announcements and housekeeping kind of things. So if you're not getting our emails and you'd like to be notified about Forum and what we're doing and or the Human Rights Working Group, these are two different mailing lists. We have a couple of sign-up sheets in the back. Just sign up there. Next Sunday, we will be having Nell Myhand, and she's from the Poor People's Campaign. And the title of her talk is Long and Bitter but Beautiful, Struggle for a New World. And it's a call for moral revival work to challenge systemic racism and other expressions of white Christian nationalism as a part of Black History Month. And the week after that, 2 weeks from today, we'll have Wayne Shung. He's going to be speaking about animal rights. His talk is titled How Animal Cruelty Fuels the MAGA Movement. So that should be interesting. Here in this room today, after church, we'll be having another meeting in here that is partially sponsored by the Human Rights Working Group. The meeting is called the Social Justice Town Hall. And for the first about 40 minutes of it, we have 3 speakers that will be talking in support of the resolution. A week from today, there's going to be a vote of the congregation, in case you didn't know that, in favor of a couple of resolutions. And one of them is one that our committee drafted, and it concerns Israel and Palestine. And it's in support of an action of immediate witness that was passed at the UUA last year. So we have coming to speak for that Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb and Reverend Emeritus Michael Yoshi and Nora Khoury, who is a local Palestinian American. And all 3 of them have been in the occupied territories in recent months and can speak about what it's exactly like over there. So we do hope you'll come back for that meeting at 12:30 here. There will be some light lunch provided, so you won't have to go hungry while you're listening to the talks. All right, so now I'll have Dolores do our Lonely Land recognition.
Good morning, everybody. How are you this morning? I'm going to do the Ohlone recognition. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other tribes. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dolores. Our speaker today is Norman Solomon. He is the National Director of rootsaction.org, and he's the Executive Director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. His latest book is titled The War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Misery Machine. He was a Bernie Sanders delegate at the DNC in 2016 and 2020. So now I'll go and pin him to the screen so you can see him, and he'll be speaking about war and militarism in the U.S. foreign policy. Thank you.
It's so important that we have a continuity of our presence, of our communication, and our commitment, which is in a marathon. And there are certainly overflows and waterfalls and negative avalanches of bad news. And it's so important that we connect with each other on an ongoing basis and we work together. I don't need to tell you that these are discouraging times. I don't need to tell you that we're in a very ominous era. where it's not only a pessimistic outlook on the world, including certainly in this country, but a lot of our fears are coming to negative fruition. And so it's just to say that it's very important that we strengthen our ongoing connection to each other, our institutions. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that I think the Sunday Forum is very important, and I'm very glad to be speaking with you today. When we think about what Martin Luther King Jr. described as the madness of militarism back in 1967, it's very difficult to find any reason to discount that description now. That madness is very much present with us today. His description of the United States as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world is as accurate today as it was in April of 1967. One of the aspects that I do want to talk about today is the ongoing situation in Palestine. And if you're somewhere in the age group that I am, you can remember back to the escalation and continuation of the Vietnam War. And I thought I'd very briefly just provide my sense of an overview of what has been happening between now and then in this country and in relation to U.S. foreign policy. The topic of my talk is prospects for restraining militarism in U.S. foreign policy in the future. And I think it's appropriate to remember what Orwell said, those who control the past control the future, those who control the present control the past, or some variation thereof. The way that we render the past is a way that the future is somewhat calibrated and made real as events unfold. And so I think a sense of the past is really very important as we try to guide the future in a better direction. Essentially, after the horrific Vietnam War, which escalated for many years, and while there was a strong anti-war movement, eventually it took years for it to develop. There was what was derided as the Vietnam Syndrome. And long story short, during the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, there was gradually a resurgence of the interventionism that was characterized by the Vietnam War, step by step, more and more. First, an attack on this tiny country of Grenada, then Panama invasion 1989, then the Gulf War, which was a massive mobilization, much celebrated by the mass media and much of the bipartisan establishment, especially the Republican Party under the first President Bush. And then under the Clinton administration, the 78 straight days of US-led bombing of Kosovo and Yugoslavia in 1999, widely celebrated by the leadership of both parties. Especially, we were told, a successful operation because there were no U.S. deaths. The U.S. Combatants, so to speak, were above it all, high in the air. And this became a motif for a form of militarism that, with ebbs and flows, has been very present. Under President Obama, the administration went to Congress and said that the United States was not at war in Libya because no Americans had died. The Americans were leading the bombing of Libya, causing chaos and suffering that has expanded in the form of terrorism in much of the region, but it was celebrated as a great victory and was not really a war, we were told, because the United States didn't have casualties among its own troops. Of course, after that point, already in the 21st century, the United States had invaded and occupied, made war in Afghanistan for 20 years. Of course, then in 2003, launched the invasion and war in Iraq. And one of the aspects that I felt it was important to write about in my book, War Made Invisible, is that while early in the century, there were massive mobilizations of US troops, hundreds of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands in Iraq and Afghanistan. Gradually, as those wars subsided, the US was unable to fully work its will militarily. The reliance on air power became more and more dominant. And that's to a large extent where we are today, as well as the United States form of militarism often taking the form of shipping huge quantities of weapons, most notably to the government of Ukraine and the government of Israel. And so it becomes a sort of a proxy war motif that we're seeing. Very few Americans being physically wounded. The drone wars of the last 2.5 decades, more and more becoming a part of the prototype. Not only drones, but all sorts of other missile strikes and bombing of a number of countries. And so we've gotten to the point where the motif, the language, the rhetoric, the duplicity has become very routine. It's become part of the echo chamber that has become so normalized. And so when we look back on the last 4 years, we can remember, and it seems like sort of a long time ago, we had President Biden going to the United Nations and telling the General Assembly, and this would have been 2021 in the autumn of that year, that the United States had turned the page and that the United States was no longer at war because the US had at last pulled all of its troops out of Afghanistan. It sounded really good. The only problem is that it was complete deception, because as in September 2021, President Biden was telling the United Nations and the world this fairy tale, the Cost of War Project at Brown University was documenting in that very month that the United States was engaged in some sort of military activity in 85 different countries, sometimes with airstrikes, often with joint maneuvers or training of military forces, so-called counterinsurgency, government joint operations, and so forth. As Nick Turse has documented in a lot of his writings, books, articles for Tom Dispatch, the United States has routinely trained military officers in Africa that have gone on to mount coups against democratically elected governments and replacing them with military regimes, which is another form of warfare, you might say. And so what has happened since September of 2021, when President Biden made his mendacious statement to the United Nations? Well, the United States has escalated its various forms of warfare. And so the madness of militarism that Dr. King spoke about has become even more deeply embedded in the psychology, the media, the political economy, and the politics of this country. And what we've experienced is a kind of a shadow play, media, semi-entertainment, what passes for journalism through major media outlets, whether it's NBC and CBS, whether it's the New York Times or Washington Post, whether it's All Things Considered and Morning Edition. What we're getting is sort of a patina of coverage, as though we are learning what war is about and what war is happening, when actually what we're getting is a very diluted form of incapability of the Fourth Estate to really convey, even within its limitations of technology, what war is about. And so what I say in the War Made Invisible book at some point is the very conceit, the very assumption that media are conveying to us what these wars are doing those assumptions actually intensify the illusions that are common in our country, that we understand what a war is because we've seen it on a screen or we've read about it on a newspaper website. And what's unfolded in that way, of course, has been very lucrative for the military-industrial complex. The shipping of weapons to Ukraine and to Israel has been fantastically profitable for the major military contractors. And I do want to point out that I don't call them defense contractors. This is not about defense. And I write in the book about how the misnaming of words is part of a process. As Orwell said, the distortive words are not responsible for us having sloppy and distorted thoughts, but those words make it easier. And so it's one of my little pet peeves, my little hobby horses for many years, completely unsuccessful, to try to persuade, make a case to even peace activists that we shouldn't be calling it a defense budget. It's not a defense budget. It's not defense spending. Yes, there's something with a capital D, Defense Department, but that doesn't mean when we talk about the budget that's now close to $1 trillion with the T dollars a year for the Pentagon, it doesn't mean that it is for defense. If it was a genuine defense budget, it would be a fraction of what the Pentagon is getting every year. And so in the case of Ukraine, the case of Israel, the news media routinely depict the spending, the appropriations, the shipment of arms and ammunition as some sort of altruistic or idealistic activity. And certainly there are many factors for why it's happening, but a major one, as Andrew Coburn has pointed out in his book, Perils of War, or Profits of War, that the profits of war are a very big factor. And obviously, it's not profits for most people, it's profits for a few. And Dr. King described this very well. He said that as with the massive military spending for the war in Vietnam, he called it a demonic, destructive suction tube that takes away from communities around the United States the capacity to provide, to meet human needs for healthcare, education, housing, infant care, elderly care. This was true in the 1960s. It's true today. Just have to walk around San Francisco and you see the crying need for the spending on human needs the spending that's going unspent. And so the militarism that has become so embedded in the popularized culture, the media, and certainly the economy of the country, this is a normalization that we've seen really intensifying in different ways now. It's not so much nearly in the form of U.S. troops, although there are U.S. troops deployed in Africa, in the Middle East, in combat situations, but on a much smaller scale. And a lot of the messaging now, and we've heard this from the Biden administration, is let's you and them fight. We are so moral that we're going to ship billions of dollars of weapons to the Ukrainian government so that the Ukrainians and the Russians can keep killing each other. And the posture is that underscores the virtue and morality of what we're told is the U.S. set of values and how moral we are, how idealistic we are. And one aspect, and there is not always agreement among progressives and even peace advocates in this country, but I think it is so crucial that, as in the case of Ukraine, we have a single standard a single standard of human rights. We do not want to in any way mirror or be a matching counterpoint to the hypocrisy that we've been hearing in the last several years, for instance, from Antony Blinken. We've had a Secretary of State flying around the world saying that there needs to be what he has called, what President Biden has called, a rules-based order. And it turns out that means we make the rules and we break the rules. It's for thee and not for me. It's the precept which the Secretary of State has enunciated, and basically every U.S. Secretary of State expresses that it's absolutely unacceptable for one country to launch an invasion on another country and seek to occupy it, which I certainly agree with. And so that precept has been articulated to condemn the very condemnable Russian invasion and war on Ukraine. This is coming from people and institutions that supported the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and now have supported for close to 16 months the Israeli war on people in Gaza. And we've seen not only the refusal of the US government, bipartisan refusal really, to engage in any serious diplomacy to prevent or end the war in Ukraine, but we're seeing a glorification of that war from the vantage point of Ukrainians. And the actual history is one where the militarism was so strong in US government policy that actual diplomacy was set aside as not really worth engaging in. You may remember that just a short time before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, President Biden had a news conference and he was asked, well, do you think that Ukraine should join NATO? And I think it's worth noting that it wasn't just Putin and his cohorts that have expressed opposition to Ukraine, and you can look at a map and you see why, opposition to Ukraine joining NATO, but that has been true for decades across the political spectrum in Russia, from the Russian democratic dissidents, strong advocates of democracy, all the way across to the oligarchs and the anti-democrats. They all agreed that it was essential for Russia not to have NATO expanded up to and through Ukraine. And yet what Biden said was, well, it's up to Ukraine. If they want to join NATO, they should join NATO if NATO wants to accept them. Can you imagine 50 years ago if the question came up, what about Canada or Mexico joining the Warsaw Pact? I mean, Washington would have gone berserk at the very concept. So it's about the world through the tinted lens of red, white, and blue, that it's one set of rules for us. As Senator Wayne Morse said during the Vietnam War, might makes right is not or should not be an acceptable foreign policy. But in this case, what happened was that the US lost an opportunity for genuine diplomacy to have a policy for Ukraine similar to Austria or Finland, some sort of quasi or real neutrality. And instead, that opportunity for diplomacy, and diplomacy is the opposite of militarism, that opportunity for diplomacy was lost. And the horrors ensued. And this doesn't in any way justify what Russia has been doing, but it does underscore that when we don't have a genuine commitment to diplomacy, then we have what we do have, which is warfare states going nuts and ginning up the enthusiasm for people to go out and kill each other. And unfortunately, this has been bipartisan. And while the Democratic Party was never really a bastion of advocates for peace, there has historically been an important segment of the Democratic Party at the base and in Congress that want to put a brake on runaway militarism. And yet, what we've seen with the Ukraine war is a real failure of the Democratic Party to provide much of alternative, if any, to the traditional Republican militarism. And we've seen that with leaders like Nancy Pelosi. We've seen that from Democratic leaders across the country, with rare exceptions. You may remember that right before the midterm, so that was a little bit over 2 years ago, it was a couple of dozen members of the Progressive Caucus in the House, all of them Democrats, sent a letter to President Biden and said, we, of course, support U.S. shipping weapons to Ukraine against the Russian invaders. We do think that diplomacy should be pursued. And when that letter was released, there was an immediate backlash, so strong, and backlash from many Democrats, that the letter was instantly, in a matter of a day or so, withdrawn, publicly withdrawn. We reject our own letter under the leadership of the top officers of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal and others. And so this was a way of reinforcing the idea that diplomacy is a dirty word. If you're as old as I am, you can remember the epithet "soft on communism." So now it's like you're soft on the Russians. Diplomacy is a word that if you use it in that context, you're suspect as to whether you might be a tool of Vladimir Putin. That's been a dominant attitude. And for well over a year now, we've seen the response from Israel of the horrific attacks that occurred on October 7th, 2023. Completely inexcusable crimes against humanity by Hamas on that date, taking more than 200 hostages, killing 1,200 people. We've seen that after October 7th, with full, complete U.S. government support, the Israeli government has engaged in mass slaughter, has engaged in intensification of ethnic cleansing, and as documented in extensive reports in December of last year by Amnesty International and by Human Rights Watch, Israel engaging in genocide. And meanwhile, in the United States, it has been very difficult to gain momentum in Congress to raise questions about the wisdom, the moral defensibility of the United States to send vast quantities of weapons to Israel. And I use an analogy, which is, you may remember, there was this horrific killing of some faculty members and many students at a grade school in Uvalde, Texas, a few years ago. And the president immediately went on television and said appropriately how horrific this was. Biden said that, when are we going to stop this killing of children with these weapons? And there was some media coverage of how was it that the gun shop owner in Uvalde could sell weapons to someone, an 18-year-old, who went out and then killed these children. And the response, of course, was from the gun shop owner was, well, I didn't know what the guns would be used for. Well, I think that comparison to President Biden and the US government in terms of selling the weapons to Israel is unfair. It's unfair to the gun shop owner in Uvalde because President Biden and the bipartisan leadership in Congress that knew what the weapons were going to be used for, they all were fully aware that, according to the United Nations, 2/3 of the people being killed by those weapons were children and women. And what we have seen from that day to this, and there's been a bit of a breach of the ceasefire, it seems to be mostly holding, but what we've seen is the unspeakable role of, quote, our own government in literally, and I do mean literally, making possible this ethnic cleansing and this genocide. From the very beginning, and I quote this in the paperback edition of War Made Invisible, long afterward about the Gaza war, generals in the Israeli military were very out front in saying, we cannot do this war in Gaza without the weapons, the ammunition, the huge bombs from the United States. So this is a reality. And it's very difficult, I think, for institutions, for individuals in our own country to acknowledge to ourselves and to publicly address that our own government is engaged in genocide. It goes against our concepts of who we are, what we've been brought up to believe the United States is, and what the United States stands for, and our role in the world. Now, just in the last hours, the news has broken that President Trump has said that Egypt and Jordan should take in refugees from Gaza. And he used the term clean out, according to news accounts, which tells us a lot about the mentality at work. And there are indications Jordan and Egypt, at least initially, do not want to accept this concept. But this has been foreseeable in terms of the game plan, the approach. What is the goal here? This would be an ultimate kind of ethnic cleansing involved in terms of Gaza. And while the former administration would decry that idea, the current administration might be pushing it very strongly. I think the reality is that this was a long-term foreseeable scenario sought by the right wing in Israel, which is now a redundancy because the right wing in Israel is the Israeli government. And also it was very foreseeable from the US support of Israel, the shipping of the weapons, the diplomatic support such as it's been. And so this gets me back to really the focus of our discussion today. What are the prospects for restraining militarism in US foreign policy in the future? I think that the reality is, in the near-term future, the prospects are very grim. And there's just been confirmation of someone to be uppercase defense secretary who is just flagrantly racist, misogynist, extremely jingoistic. And it's a more overt form of what I think we could acknowledge has been inherent in the US military and inherent in its view of the world, that the United States, when it needs to, has every right to use its military might to attempt to work its will on the world. And that a unipolar world is not only desirable, but ostensibly necessary. We could remember the phrase that was used by the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State. We've had, under the Obama administration, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, used terms like the United States is the indispensable nation. And it ought to raise the question, indispensable to who? The 96% of the world population that doesn't live in the United States would probably do just fine, thank you, without the US military trying to work its way on the world. But most of all, the United States is indispensable to itself, or at least those in power present our national destiny in those terms. And as we know, as the COVID epidemic has shown, as the climate emergency has shown, as the threat of nuclear annihilation has shown, we are all one planet and humanity together. And the delusion that somehow the US can and should work its way on the world militarily in concert with its economic power and so forth, that truly is a delusion. It truly is not only a pathway to genocide in conflicts, but it's a pathway to omnicide, the destruction of almost all human beings on this planet with a runaway nuclear arms race that the United States continues to lead. I wish that I had more upbeat presentation to make at this particular junction in history, but I'm again really glad to be able to participate in this Sunday forum, and I look forward to any questions and comments that people have.
Thank you, Norman. We do have a few questions already. People on Zoom, please type your questions in chat and I'll check them in a minute and bring them to you. Let's see. Is there anything you would say to progressives that we should or should do or demand from the Democratic Party to change U.S. militarism? Or should we work outside the Democratic Party, such as Working Families Party, mass demonstrations, or other tactics?
Oh, thanks. That's a really good cluster of questions and really key. Well, one aspect is I think we're too nice to Democrats in Congress as constituents. And of course, we want to adhere to nonviolence, and we don't want to be in any way negative towards the humanity of other people who happen to be in office. But progressives have been habitually, with few exceptions, just way too deferential to senators and representatives who go to Congress. And as a result, they just blow us off because we're not disrupting their public image. And I think that because there are some things that Democrats in Congress are doing that are laudable, they're fighting Republicans on some issues, they're carrying forward agendas for strengthening safety nets in many cases, there's a tendency to say, well, okay, you're doing some really good things. Meanwhile, these folks, so to speak, are often just stoking the war machine. And yet, it's very rare for progressives to picket the district offices of members of Congress. I think that's a complete mistake. These are what we might not too politely call warmongers. They have a D after their names. Every member of the US House in the Bay Area is a Democrat. And except for Barbara Lee and usually Ro Khanna, most of them are just very enthusiastically pushing the war agenda and the military-industrial complex. We have two senators who are just abysmal now in that way. So I think we need to be much more publicly assertive, use nonviolent direct action. However we're comfortable, picket lines, civil disobedience, articulating why we're doing it, and going ahead and doing it. I think a sad reality is that when it gets to federal and state offices where there is a partisan designation, a party affiliation on the ballot, that the only viable thing to do is to work to transform and move in a very progressive direction the Democratic Party. You have to look at, I think, or it's very helpful to look at, after 40 years, the Green Party has not come anywhere near electing a single member of Congress. And yet we have people like Rashida Tlaib, we have people like Ilhan Omar, and they have run as Democrats, and they've been willing and able to run that gauntlet, not always pleasant, to galvanize some power in the halls of power. And I think that's, unfortunately, in an electoral arena, I think that's where we need to go.
Thank you. Next question is, I think, kind of implying that there are more shades to the analysis than you're allowing. So they wrote, although I agree with many of your conclusions about the historical analysis, it doesn't give an inch of respect to defense of U.S. foreign policy. You should show how controlling the narrative influences perceptions. Are you able to explain that?
Yeah. And maybe the question could explain a little bit more. I think in terms of defending, if I'm understanding right, defense of the United States militarily, is that part of the question?
Defending the policies that our country has had for so many years.
Well, there's a lot of policies. I mean, the United States has had a whole lot of policies. On climate, slow, if it's compared to the Trump policies, then they've been great under Obama and under Biden. If the climate policies are compared to what they would need, they've been pretty abysmal. They're not meeting the emergency. They're sort of partway measures. Is the United States the only country that does evil in the world? No, of course not. And I think that the United States has sometimes done some good things overseas, around family planning, for instance, but the militarism is just so strong. And sometimes it does the right thing for the wrong reasons, which in the long run really matter. And I think Ukraine arguably is an example.
Thank you. If the current administration illegally orders the federal military to commit unconstitutional acts, what prospects that military might unconstitutionally defy civilian orders?
It's really interesting question as well, and I have no confidence in that. It's very easy to fire a Secretary of Defense and appoint and put another one in, and even before confirmation, that person would be an acting Secretary of Defense. And during the last Trump administration, there was somebody who had a modicum of integrity in that job. The one who was just confirmed, not even. So I hate to be so downbeat. I'm looking for glimmers of silver linings here in the very dark clouds. But just to digress briefly, when I was growing up, the narrative, and it was true to some extent, was that the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon were dragging Kennedy and Johnson more into war. They were war hawks, right? And I think that dynamic has really changed under the Trump administration. It was the military people who were trying to restrain, because they knew Trump was nutty. And so you had people in the Pentagon at the top levels, the Joint Chiefs of Staff people, and they knew Trump was a dangerous nut. And so comparatively, they were really the restraining forces, the military. But I think, unfortunately, now Trump has had the capacity through Project 2025 and so forth, help from the Heritage Foundation. They're trying to get in people that are complete yes men and yes women. And just to get to the point, the public, we have to organize. To counteract these forces, we're just going to really have to organize and mobilize electorally and in terms of public pressure.
Which NGOs are addressing militarism effectively? Which U.S. representatives are the most effective in addressing militarism and humane public policy?
Uh, trying to respond to the second question first. Well, the Democrats have been in minority in the House for a while. Now, as of a few weeks, also in the Senate. And in the House, I think there have been very important voices. They don't have the gavel. They can't even hold hearings. But as I mentioned, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, usually Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Unfortunately, we've lost two from the last election in the primaries, thanks to AIPAC dumping in unprecedented amounts of money, up to $10, $12 million in a primary. We lost Jamal Bowman, we lost Cori Bush. So it's a matter of degree. I mean, on a good day, some good issues, there might be some outspoken. Jeff Merkley, senator from Oregon. Of course, Bernie Sanders, after a slow start, beginning in late fall last year, became a great voice and advocate to end the arming of Israel. It's even slimmer pickings, though, in terms of pushing for diplomacy on the Ukraine war. So, I think we need to light a fire under some folks. In the Bay Area, we've lost Barbara Lee in Congress, and Ro Khanna, I think, is sometimes very outspoken. Those folks, whoever, I hesitate to suggest because her ears are really intentionally stopped up, but if you live in San Francisco, pressure on Nancy Pelosi. About the other question, there are a lot of groups that are struggling, underfunded. Peace Action has done a lot of good work. I'm sure people know Code Pink is very active. There are arms control groups in DC, often too restrained, I believe, too cozy with the Biden administration. They're going to be more outspoken now. Not to toot our own horn, but at rootsaction.org, we've organized in the last 10 years against militarism. That's one of our very major focuses. And if you're not signed up to rootsaction.org, we have 1.2 million people signed up. A small fraction of them are active all the time, but it's a way to mobilize nationally. And if you're not already signed up, you can get email alerts by simply going to rootsaction.org, and on the homepage you can sign up. That's rootsaction.org.
Rootsaction.org is great. The latest message I got from them was about James Zogby being nominated to the DNC committee.
Right.
Okay. Why is the UN so unable to stop countries from continuing wars and crises? Is it something in its setup?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Unfortunately, I think the Security Council setup means that only, 5 permanent members have any sort of real power to mandate action. And the reality has been that the United States just wields enormous power. And so nobody's going to become Secretary General without getting it okay from the US and the other Security Council members. And, if it was up to the General Assembly, we would have a much more progressive UN. And I think it comes down to power. I mean, when I was working on the afterword for the paperback of War Made Invisible, I poured through the reports from the United Nations, and they were brilliant and they were on it. And the Secretary General was putting out pleas from late October of 2023 about what was going on in Gaza. And so in that situation, as a case in point, the UN has just been adamant that what has been going on for 15 months in Gaza is just horrendous. It has to stop. There's been heartrending appeals with plenty of data continually. And the US government, with bipartisan support out of the White House, has just lied, deceived, circumnavigated truth, and just assisted with a genocide.
Here's a comment. My sense is that your argument against militarism would be stronger if if it were economic, looking at opportunities to serve U.S. citizens with education and healthcare instead of providing weapons to others.
Well, it's certainly a key point. And as I quoted from Dr. King, he said that the military spending was a demonic, destructive suction tube. I had a piece in the Chronicle a couple of years ago about the budget adjustment that I was glad they actually headlined that quote from King. I think that's right. That's part of the argument that needs to be made. It clearly has not carried the day, given, as we know, the budget is a moral document. And so it's an immoral budget. It's an immoral document. It's the set of priorities. I do want to say, though, in the case of nuclear weapons, there's been a hope that by making the economic argument that there will be a curtailment of spending on nuclear weapons. That hope has been not realized. That expectation or that strategy has been a complete failure. And I think along with the lobbying power of those who are profiteering, the few who are profiteering from the nuclear weapons industry, a reality is, and this affects military spending generally, if people feel that their survival is at stake to have nuclear weapons upgraded, then they will do it. If they think the survival of their family and their country and their community and their country is dependent on spending, then they're going to say spend the money. So we do need to make, I believe, the argument that the money needs to be spent on healthcare, education, housing, and so forth. We need to make that argument. It's necessary but insufficient. We also need to debunk and undermine the argument that having 400 ICBMs ready to launch on hair trigger, that is preventing us from being destroyed. We have to make both of those arguments, I think.
Okay. Going to consolidate a couple of questions here. There is a lawsuit being brought against U.S. representatives and senators who've approved military aid to Israel in the Northern California area in violation of various U.S. laws. Do you think this is an effective strategy and against the war machine? Yeah,
I think it's a strategy worth pursuing among many. I'm a plaintiff on that lawsuit. We have like 25 names on it, but it has now increased to about 900 plaintiffs in the North Bay North Coast, represented by Congresspeople Jared Huffman and Mike Thompson. However, and I wrote about this, if you're interested in reading it, I wrote a piece. If you just Google my name and The Hill, thehill.com, I wrote a piece on this a couple of weeks ago, and I point out that federal courts have basically refused to intervene on foreign policy and military policy. And so the chances of the federal court in San Francisco siding with us as plaintiffs, it's close to zero. I mean, frankly, it's just not going to happen. But by bringing these lawsuits in the court of public opinion in the process, I think it's important. I wouldn't depend on courts doing anything useful in this way, but I think that plaintiffs and organizers can use this as a way to engage in public education and awareness, and also to build networks, because in the long run, we need to communicate with each other more effectively and organize more effectively. And I would just footnote this. We've all heard the phrase, and I certainly have used the phrase, speak truth to power. And I think that's useful, but more important to speak truth about power, because if we're simply in supplication speaking truth to power, frankly, power already knows what it's doing to a large extent. And if we're up there looking up vertically, we may spend less energy being candid and analytical about power to each other so we can organize more astutely and effectively.
So we're here in Nancy Pelosi's district, not in Jared Huffman's. How can we support that lawsuit, or would you recommend expanding it to include Nancy Pelosi, or what could we do about that?
That's very prophetic. There has been a lawsuit expansion filed with the federal court about 10 days ago to include Nancy Pelosi. And there is already a list of plaintiffs to that lawsuit that's being expanded. So to get your name on the record, it can be done. If you email me, I'll forward it to the organizers. And my email is pretty easy to remember, just my first name at rootsaction.org. So Norman at rootsaction.org. And you can become a plaintiff. And I just footnoted, the courts are going to be the war makers' friends on this, as they routinely are, but it is a good organizing tool.
Thank you. I'll follow up with you. How to get the left, even here in San Francisco, to work together. None of us like Nancy Pelosi or our awful senators.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. I think that it takes a lot of stick-to-itiveness and organizing, and I think of a precept, and this goes to the question of third party, Green Party. There's a tactical precept that I've heard that makes a lot of sense to me. When you're in the struggle with an adversary, don't do what you most want to do. Do what your adversary least wants you to do. And in the electoral case, what we most want to do, perhaps, is run as a Green, because the Democratic Party is so, as we discussed, deficient in so many ways. But there's no way that a Green Party candidate is going to be a threat to someone like Nancy Pelosi or somebody who wants to step into her shoes in a couple of years. So to me, that means running as a Democrat and being serious about it. I mean, I've run for Congress, I've learned a lot, and too often people on the left run as an impulse item. They plan maybe a month or 2 or 3 months from now, or before the election. Who knows if Pelosi's going to run again? Probably not, I would guess. Hopefully not. There should be a candidate working now, should be filing at least a what's it called, a exploratory committee with the FEC, and begin to run a campaign as a Democrat, quote unquote, with a genuine progressive agenda. But as I think the question alludes to, this is also a challenge because it's easy to fragment the left vote, and we need to be more united. And we think about the mayoral race where you had was it Jane Kim and Mark Leno, and it was fragmented, and they were both far better candidates than the mayor who defeated them, right? Or the person who became mayor. And I had my own personal experience with that. We had half a dozen people each getting 1% of the vote because they weren't serious candidates. Even though they were progressive candidates, were not serious. So I would say, plan far ahead, try to unite around one candidate, and be methodical about a campaign.
Do you think that international communication among people is helpful in generating anti-militarism voices effectively in the U.S.?
I think it is. It can. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Are there international groups helpful in addressing U.S. fascism?
Yeah. At rootsaction.org, our campaign coordinator is also director of World Beyond War, David Swanson. And we've worked together to organize an international set of actions against military bases, trying to shut them down all over the world. And it's prominent on our homepage of our website, so people can get involved. There are going to be a lot of protests on the same day around the world. I think it's late February. And so if you go to rootsaction.org, you'll see a way to get involved. I think that's very, very valuable. We have national problems that can't be addressed effectively internationally, but some can be done that way. And I think, as we saw in the 1980s, protests against the Pershing II and the cruise missiles in Europe, it can really be effective to have international action. And what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry.
Let's see. I think that was the whole question.
Oh, okay.
Okay. What organizations or persons are doing nonviolent trainings of groups in person, like civil disobedience training? Some people in the congregation here are talking about the potential need to do this probably in an immigration context more than militarism, but certainly militarism too.
Yes. Um, at Roots Action, we have launched a pledge of non-cooperation with mass deportation. And you can find that on our website at rootsaction.org. You'll see at the bottom of that homepage, blast from the past, and you'll see a couple of email blasts on that. So certainly that pledge is not an end in itself. A few thousand people have signed that particular pledge of non-cooperation. And then once you sign the pledge, we're sending periodic email updates on a lot of different activities that are involved, including nonviolent civil disobedience. So that would be one, one aspect. Another comes to mind is that a Project Roots Action is the Teach-In Network. And we have actually, as it happens, it will be at 5 o'clock California time this coming Thursday. We're doing a webinar about how to protest. And it's both campus protests and off-campus protests. So everybody's invited 5 p.m. this coming Thursday. And it's really about some of these issues of organizing nonviolent resistance. And I should say, you can find information on that at the top of the homepage at teachinnetwork.org. No hyphen, just teachinnetwork.org. And again, if you have any trouble finding this info, just email me at norman@rootsaction.org.
Yes. What do you think about these two groups, Public Citizen and ECO? That's spelled EKO.
I'm not familiar with EKO, but Public Citizen, I think, does a lot of really excellent work and fighting an uphill battle for accountability, for transparency, for lack of corruption, which is rife in Washington, some of it legal, some of it illegal. So it's one of our many precious institutions that should be supported.
Okay. A couple of questions now on the relationship between militarism and capitalism. Could you speak to the underlying economic structures that drive capitalist, imperialist countries to compete and even go to war with each other, or such as World War I and World War II, US and China, and how we can get out of the situation without changing those underlying structures? The second question is, do you think the democracies are corrupt and beholden to capitalists? Many young people have come to that conclusion and deserted them.
Yeah, these are such great questions, all of them. I'm reminded the mention of World War I is that reminds me that John Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, he referred to it as a traders' war, TRADERS' war. And these are certainly an economic driver. Nobody even knew what that war was about, in a sense, but it certainly was conflicts of trading blocks and so forth. My own outlook is that we're seeing the fruition of runaway capitalism, and that there's a grotesque logic to capitalism that leads to militarism. And you can have militarism in a country that isn't per se capitalist. You know, there are other ways to get there. But this is a horrendous runaway train of capitalism, and the kind of profiteering that is just so massive, and it got a big boost after 9/11, the military-industrial intelligence complex. This is just an unrestrained quest to maximize profits for individuals and corporations. And so there's a horrible logic to where all this is going. And on the domestic policy as well, I mean, the Elon Musk isn't just a fluke. You know, when you consolidate economic power and wealth, it's as Bernie Sanders has articulated so well, oligarchy is antithetical to democracy. And I think democracy is always damaged, often or at times fatally, by militarism. So it's swirling in a negative direction, to put it mildly. And we have, naming naming the problem is just a little bit of the solution. We can say it's capitalism. I think it is capitalism. It's corporate capitalism run amok. Naming it is a beginning, but we have to organize to challenge it.
Speaking as an isolationist, Trump has said, let foreign governments take care of their own problems. In addition, his focus on government. Sorry, can't quite read this. He wants to withdraw and prevent worldwide militarism, allegedly. Do you believe this? And what do you make of that?
Yeah, you want to buy the Brooklyn Bridge for me? Or say Golden Gate Bridge? Well, here's somebody, Donald Trump, who is fully capable, as he's shown, of denouncing Democrats in the same speech as being wimps and being warmongers. They're too weak and too strong. And this is typical of Trump. Here's a proto-isolationist who wants to take over the Panama Canal and in Greenland. So there's no logic other than corporate greed, megalomania, egotism run amok. And so I think the cabinet has shown that this guy is as militarist as anybody. It's just going to be different forms. Even, a broken clock being correct once in a while. So even his better comments in recent years about the Ukraine war, he's already rattling sabers at Putin about Ukraine now.
What is your take on AOC? Is she a good progressive in the House? She seems to have walked back some of her positions. Are there no local leaders except for Bernie in the Senate?
Yeah.
Progressive leaders.
Yeah. I think AOC has done so many terrific things. I have to say, there's been some real disappointments lately. She's been, from an anti-war perspective, good on Gaza, like almost every Democrat in the House, afraid to take on the continuous massive military aid without diplomacy to Ukraine. One of the precepts I think that we ought to try to hold everybody in office to is don't lie to us. Don't tell us stuff that just flagrantly isn't true. And AOC's fallen down on that. She gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention, and she said that Kamala Harris was working night and day to get a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, we didn't fall off a turnip truck. We know that that's absurd. But she said it. And another example, and by the way, Roots Action launched a Don't Run Joe campaign more than 2 years ago, right after the midterms. And we couldn't get any big national groups to join us. AOC endorsed, like Kamala Harris, Pramila Jayapal, AOC endorsed endorsed Biden early on. So here you have AOC very early saying Biden should run for re-election. And for that matter, Bernie did that also. That said, overall, I think Bernie has been a great senator. Jeff Merkley's been almost as good. Few and far between.
We're running short on time, and we have quite a few more questions on the cards here. Most of the remaining ones do relate to Gaza. So let me just read a few of them, and then you can think about how to address them. Do you think the U.S. will ever be held to account for supporting the Israeli war crimes? Who will charge them? And then the next question is there a way to sue the U.S. for genocide? Of course, we were just talking about that suit against Jared Huffman and the other member of Congress. So those two questions first.
Yeah, we've been mulling those over, those points over at Roots Action, what we might be able to do. What echoes in my mind in response to those really good questions is what Barack Obama said as he first came into the presidency. He said, we need to look forward, not backward, about the torturers in the top echelons of the George W. Bush administration. And this is a very dangerous paradigm. It doesn't mean you have to put people up against the wall and execute them. It doesn't mean you have to even imprison them. It means that you need to do what was done in South Africa with the fall of apartheid. You do a reconciliation, peace and reconciliation commission, and you get the truth out as best you can. And I think that should be a goal. I think we should struggle for that. I think we should be very public about it. Netanyahu should be at The Hague. Biden should be at The Hague. It's very unlikely to happen. But I think we should strive for, not out of vengeance, but out of truthfulness, get the record straight in public. The less we do that, the easier it is for people to replicate past crimes with future crimes.
You mentioned the need to pressure the Democratic Party to become more progressive. Please explain is it the ADM convention event? There's an event coming up on February 23rd that you may know about. Can that be done there?
Well, very soon, the registration will close to vote or to run and to vote for, it's called ADEM, it's Assembly District Democratic Party Central Committee. And so you can, again, email me because I can send you material on this. There's still time for you to run, I believe, certainly to vote. And the Central Committee of the State Democratic Party is partly chosen by Democrats who can just run and vote. Not dominantly. I was on that committee for 10 years. I got to tell you, it's a virtual dictatorship. It's evolved. Every chair has been, you remember John Burton used to be chair. He had what do you say, a potty mouth, is sometimes said about John Burton, but he was an anti-war progressive who believed in democracy in the party. That is pretty much gone at the top, but it's a struggle to change that. And that has to do with then trying to get a more progressive California Democratic Party. So if you email me, I'd be glad to send info on how to get involved.
I think we'll do just one more question. Please talk about the damage done to U.S. free speech by politicians' support for the Israeli government's talking points. How can this process be disrupted from the perspective of free speech in the U.S.?
Yeah, this is hugely important. You may have seen Michelle Goldberg had a piece on this the other day, the attack on progressives in academia. The right wing has always hated academia. They hate information that isn't spun to the right. And a dream is coming true for the right wing, which is propelled not entirely, but to a large extent by the AIPACs, the Israel right or wrong crowds. And so there's a witch hunt going on. And this was exploited after October 7th, 2023. And this witch hunt is going after, we're not talking Alabama or Mississippi, we're talking Harvard and Columbia as well. It's an attempt to suppress freedom of speech. And we're really trying, and so many people are trying to push back against it. And we have to just have that fortitude to say, there is something called the First Amendment. We're not going to back down and be willing to really put up a fight at every stage. And this is something, again, that we're addressing in our Teaching Network forum coming up Thursday night. And again, I'd invite all of you to go to teachingnetwork.org. You can sign up, be part of that, because this battle is everywhere. It's even in the most liberal parts of the country, and we're going to all need to work on it together.
Thank you so much, Norman.
Well, thanks to everybody being part of this forum. I appreciate the chance to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Okay, just to wrap up, please come back next week. Our speaker next week will be Nell Myhand. She's a part of the Poor People's Campaign, and her talk is titled The Long and Bitter but Beautiful Struggle for a New World. And the week after that, we have Wayne Shung, a member of this church, is going to be speaking about animal rights. His talk is called How Animal Cruelty Supports MAGA. So that should be a good talk too. We don't have anything scheduled for the last 2 Sundays of February, but we are looking for topics. It is Black History Month, so we're looking especially for topics related to that. And I want to tell you that right here in this room at 12:30, there's going to be a meeting that the Human Rights Working Group has had done a lot of work to prepare for. We have 3 speakers here. Will be short talks, It's in relation to the resolution that we will be voting on a week from today that our committee drafted concerning Israel and Palestine. We want this congregation to be an apartheid-free community, and so we have brought Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb here to speak. We have Reverend Emeritus of the Bethany Methodist Church in Malameda, Michael Yoshi, and finally a Palestinian voice will be in the room here, Nora Khoury, who is a local activist that some of you may know. So please come back at 12:30. There will be light lunch as well. And now I'd like to bring Art Persico up here. He has a few announcements of his own. Three
quick ones. One, today there's a hike with Stop AI. That's Sunday, January 26th, 3 to 5 p.m. Go to the Land's End Main Parking Lot Trail on Mary Way, San Francisco. There's free snacks and it says, join us for a hike in the park to discuss how AI threatens our jobs, privacy, and lives, and what we can do about it. There's some of these flyers at the back of the room. You can take this one. Secondly, today is the second day of the Social and Economic Music Justice and Music Festival. It's at Mission High School all day, culminating in a concert tonight. I believe it's at 6 o'clock. So I have a couple of these cards, or you can just online look up Social and Economic Justice Music Festival, San Francisco. And finally, Norman mentioned the ADAM elections. The candidate deadline has passed. I'm a candidate. I have flyers at the back of the room. Suzanne Cowan will be handing them out, or you can get it from me. So the kinds of Democrats we want to be running our state Democratic Party, there's a progressive slate called Grassroots Rising, and I encourage you to register and vote. It's fairly simple, but if you just read the flyer, and if you want a copy sent to you, just send me an email, and my email address and phone number is at the bottom of the first page. And the second page has a little bit about me. Thank you very much.